The day began like any other along the quiet coastline. The waves moved in their usual rhythm, rushing softly against the rocks, and the sky looked calm, as if nothing unusual could possibly happen. A few early walkers strolled lazily along the shore, enjoying the fresh morning air. No one expected their peaceful routine to be interrupted by something strange, something that would become the talk of the entire town. It started when a fisherman, who liked checking the water before sunrise, saw something unusual floating a short distance from the shore. At first, he thought it was just seaweed or scraps carried in by the tide. He almost ignored it. But when he looked again, he noticed several tiny shapes drifting together. They were too organized to be random debris. He narrowed his eyes, trying to understand what he was looking at. Within minutes, curiosity got the best of him. He waved at two people nearby and pointed out toward the water. They looked, squinting hard, trying to make sense of the scene. The shapes were small, so small that from the shore they looked like little dots moving slowly but steadily. The fisherman climbed onto a rock for a better view, and the others followed. Soon more people noticed the small cluster forming in the water. Someone laughed and said it looked like pieces of broken toys. Another joked that maybe a group of kids from the nearby school had thrown their projects into the sea. A few teenagers joined in, amused at what seemed like a silly sight. It didn't look dangerous, important, or serious, just odd. But then the group noticed something else. The little structures weren't floating randomly. They were moving in a pattern. They arranged themselves in a neat line and slightly shifted as if adjusting their position. The movement was slow but coordinated. That was when the laughter paused for a moment. People exchanged confused looks. "No way those are moving on their own," someone said. But as they watched, they kept adjusting and regrouping as if following invisible instructions. A small crowd of maybe a dozen people began to gather. Some took out their phones to zoom in and record. Others joked loudly to keep the mood light, though it was clear no one fully understood what they were witnessing. Curiosity spread quickly, and a few more residents joined as the news traveled from person to person along the walkway. One observer, an older man who often carried binoculars for bird watching, offered them to the fisherman. When he looked through the lens, he froze. What he saw didn't make sense. The structures looked like tiny boats, very tiny each, built with surprising detail. They weren't leaves, plastic, shells, or random junk. They had clean shapes, smooth surfaces, and small extensions that looked like sails or beams. The fisherman handed the binoculars to the person next to him and climbed down from the rock, now even more confused. Those who looked through the binoculars had the same reaction, confusion mixed with disbelief. They couldn't understand how something so small could look so carefully designed. Within the hour, the crowd grew much larger. People filming with their phones joked that the little boats must be part of some prank or a marketing stunt. A few called them the Tiny Fleet, laughing as they said it. The name spread quickly as people shouted it out, amused at how serious others were taking it. But then someone pointed out how the boats were moving. They weren't drifting with the tide. They were fighting against it, adjusting their direction. Even someone with no knowledge of the sea could tell that something about their movement was intentional. The laughter grew quieter. News reached the small research center located a few kilometers away. It wasn't a large facility, just a place where a handful of researchers studied marine patterns and shoreline changes. They received a call from a bystander who described the strange little boats floating near the shore. At first, the person on the phone thought it was a prank. But after hearing more calls from different people, they decided to send a small team to check. When the researchers arrived, they found a group of nearly 50 people gathered at the edge of the rocks, talking excitedly, pointing, filming, guessing, and laughing. Some insisted the objects were just harmless toys, while others believed it was something unusual. The researchers pushed through politely, trying to get closer to the front of the crowd. One of them, a quiet man who usually kept to himself, took a long look before speaking. He had spent years working with marine instruments and small-scale structures, so he knew the difference between natural objects and something made intentionally. The longer he looked, the more certain he felt. "These aren't toys," he said softly to another member of the team. The woman beside him frowned. "You sure?" They looked tiny. Too tiny. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully observed how the little boats were arranged. They were steady. They weren't wobbling or twisting like debris. And when the wind pushed them slightly, they corrected themselves again, almost like they had tiny stabilizers. People around them continued joking loudly, calling the boats mini-pirates, floating ants, and baby ships. A group of teenagers even pretended to command them from the shore, shouting fake instructions and laughing when the crowd smiled. But the researchers weren't amused. Something about the tiny fleet felt too precise, too deliberate. They asked for a small motorboat to be brought around so they could go out and retrieve. One of the tiny objects docked when the boat arrived. Two of the researchers climbed aboard, while the others stayed behind to watch. The crowd cheered playfully as the boat started moving out toward the floating structures. Some made videos saying dramatic things like, "Scientists versus the toy ships," making the whole thing seem like a silly adventure dot as the research boat approached. The tiny vessels did something that surprised everyone. They didn't scatter or drift away. Instead, they formed a tighter cluster, as if trying to stay together. The researchers slowed their approach so as not to create too much disturbance. They carefully scooped one of the boats out of the water using a small net and placed it inside a clear container. From the shore, the crowd clapped jokingly, acting as if it were some big victory. But the researchers didn't react. Their faces had turned serious. Once the boat returned to shore, people leaned forward to get a closer look. The tiny boat inside the container looked even more mysterious up close. It was about the size of a matchbox, but it wasn't simple at all. It had a smooth, curved shape, and the material didn't look cheap or fragile. It wasn't wood, plastic, or metal that anyone recognized easily. It felt sturdy, but incredibly lightweight. The surface had tiny marks lines that looked too straight and neat to be natural. The edges were clean, almost perfect. It looked like something created with careful attention. People stopped laughing. They lowered their phones and leaned in with curiosity. Even those who were joking the loudest earlier had fallen silent. A few whispered to each other, wondering if this was some kind of new technology dot. The quiet researcher who had spoken earlier studied the tiny boat closely. He didn't say anything yet, but his eyes widened with every detail he noticed. The delicate features of the miniature structure didn't match anything he had seen before. Every part looked intentionally designed. Even the bottom of the tiny vessel had patterns that seemed too precise for randomness. He looked up and said, in a calm but firm voice, "This didn't just appear here. Someone made this." People around him asked who could have made such small, detailed boats. No one had an answer. Some guessed it might be from a nearby studio or a group of model makers. Others whispered that maybe it came from a scientific experiment. A few still thought it might be a prank, though their voices were less confident now. The researcher gently turned the container in his hands, watching how the tiny vessel stayed level without any visible mechanism. Its design was too delicate for normal tools, especially for something created in secrecy. There were no obvious clues, no marks showing who built it, no labels, no signs of origin. The sky was still calm, but the mood along the shore had changed completely. What began as a joke had transformed into a mystery. People who came just to look out of curiosity are now speaking quietly. trying to guess who was behind such delicate craftsmanship. As the crowd watched the little boat inside the container. The tiny fleet still floating in the water changed formation again. This time, the shift was more noticeable. They created a wider curve, each one keeping the same distance from the next. The pattern was too perfect to ignore. Someone whispered, "This can't be an accident." No one laughed now. What had started as a random morning at the shore had turned into something far more intriguing. People who had walked by casually earlier now refused to leave. They wanted to see what would happen next. And even though no one said it out loud, everyone felt the same quiet, strange thought taking shape. Who made these tiny ships, and why were they here? That question hung in the air as the researchers prepared to take the sample back to their laboratory, not knowing that this discovery was only the beginning of a much bigger story. The news spread faster than anyone expected. By the time the researchers carried the tiny boat back toward their vehicle, dozens of people had already posted videos online. Most viewers reacted the same way the crowd at the shore had reacted at first, with laughter. Many commenters assumed it was just a funny morning incident. Some called it a miniature navy, while others joked that maybe a group of kids had built tiny boats during school vacations. The internet loves strange little events, and within hours, the videos had thousands of views. But while the online world treated it like a joke, the mood at the research center was completely different. The team drove the sample back to their small facility, and even during the drive, they couldn't stop staring at the delicate structure inside the clear container. It was hard to believe that something this tiny, this detailed, and this steady could be found drifting quietly near the shore. At the shoreline, the crowd grew even bigger. More people arrived after watching the online clips, expecting to be amused. Some parents brought their children so they could see the toy boats. Teenagers came with their cameras ready, hoping to catch something new to post. There was a sense of excitement mixed with disbelief, like everyone expected a big reveal or someone stepping forward to expose a prank. Several younger kids stared at the floating objects with wide eyes. They had never seen anything like it. One child asked his mother if small fairies lived inside the boats, which made everyone around smile for a moment. Even adults who came to laugh found themselves staring a little too long, trying to understand how these tiny structures were staying so perfectly arranged in the water. Few people continued making jokes loudly, calling it the Great Tiny Invasion. But even they kept glancing back to see if the boats would move again. And they did. When the wind picked up slightly, everyone expected the little boats to drift apart or tilt. Instead, they shifted gently, adjusting position to keep their formation. The change wasn't dramatic enough to scare anyone, but it was strange enough to make even the loudest jokers quiet down. People leaned forward, watching closely, waiting to see if they would move again. A man in the crowd, who worked with fishing nets, shook his head slowly. "That's not normal," he said softly. "No way tiny things like that should stay in shape against the wind." Those standing around him heard the certainty in his voice. He had spent his whole life by the sea and knew the difference between random drifting and controlled movement. But he didn't sound scared, just deeply curious. Meanwhile, at the research center, the team placed the tiny vessel under a magnifying device. The moment the enlarged image appeared on the screen, everyone fell completely silent. The details were unbelievable. The tiny support beams were aligned with precision. The surface had smooth curves that suggested advanced tools. Tiny structural lines showed careful planning. It was nothing like the rough work of a child's project or a simple hobbyist creation. The team members exchanged looks, trying to find the right words. One of them finally whispered, "Someone made this. And whoever did it knows exactly what they're doing." But the questions kept growing. Why were the boats at the shore? Who built them? And why were they behaving like they were following some pattern? Back at the shore, a group of young adults debated these questions loudly. One insisted it was a marketing stunt, maybe for a tech company or a new film. Another argued that the boats were too small for any advertisement to succeed. No one will notice something that's small unless they get really close, he said. A woman standing nearby added, "But look at the crowd now." Everyone came. She wasn't wrong. There were now more than 100 people gathered. Cars were parked along the road. Some locals climbed onto higher rocks to get a better view. A reporter from a local newspaper arrived with a small camera. She interviewed several onlookers, asking what they saw and what they thought. Most people repeated the same thing, that it looked funny at first, but now it was starting to feel like something else. Something more serious, or at least more mysterious. She recorded a short video and uploaded it online. In less than an hour, more people began driving toward the shore. Groups arrived from nearby towns out of pure curiosity. What was supposed to be a quiet day had turned into an unexpected gathering. The little fleet remained floating calmly, maintaining its shape. A few of the boats drifted slightly, but every time, the formation adjusted itself again. The movements seemed gentle and natural, but not random. The longer people observed, the more it felt like the boats had some kind of awareness of their surroundings. A man who worked in construction watched the tiny fleet for a long time before saying, "Whoever built these has skills." He explained to the people near him how even large structures required balance and proper shaping. And seeing such accuracy in something that small made him truly impressed. Another person noted that the material didn't look like regular plastic. Even from a distance, the boats had a slight reflective quality. They didn't look cheap or weak. They almost looked like miniature versions of high-quality watercraft. As the day went on, people stopped laughing entirely. Instead of jokes, there were murmurs of speculation. Some wondered if it was part of a science project. Others thought maybe it was created by an artist. A few made wild guesses involving science fiction ideas, which made the crowd chuckle lightly. But even those guesses carried a tiny doubt, because no one had a better explanation. Meanwhile, the researchers carefully studied the tiny sample in their lab. They used various tools to examine the edges, structure, and material. They discovered that the tiny beams were perfectly symmetrical. They could see microscopic tool marks that weren't accidental. They also noticed the layers of material were applied with a method that required steady hands and a deep understanding of shaping. One researcher leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "This is advanced," he said. "Whoever built this wasn't just playing around. They have real skill." Another researcher added quietly, "This could be part of something much bigger." They all recognized that if one tiny boat was this detailed, the rest of the fleet had to be equally impressive. And someone had built not just one, but several dozen of them. When they looked at the material more closely, they realized it wasn't common plastic. Instead, it seemed to be a combination of lightweight composites. Nothing dangerous, just unusual. It reminded them of the type of material used for small drones or advanced models. Back at the shoreline, a group of older residents shared their thoughts. Many had lived near the sea for decades. They had seen strange things before: unusual driftwood, odd fish, even forgotten cargo pieces washed up. But none of them had ever seen something so tiny, yet so precise. One older resident said, "It's easy to laugh at things we don't understand. But this feels different. There's something behind this. Someone put effort into it." The children, meanwhile, were fascinated. They didn't overthink it like the adults did. They simply watched with pure curiosity, trying to figure out how something so small stayed in place. They asked innocent questions that even the adults couldn't answer. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the light hit the water at just the right angle, making the tiny fleet sparkle. The reflection made the little boats looked like tiny silver fragments floating on a sheet of gold. The crowd gasped softly at the beauty of the scene. Even people who were ready to leave stayed a little longer. The mood shifted further when one of the boats in the center of the formation moved slightly ahead of the others. It wasn't pushed by wind. There was no strong breeze at that moment. The movement was subtle, but obvious enough that the entire crowd reacted. A wave of whispers spread across the shore. A man in the crowd said, "Did they just—" Someone else replied, "Yes." They moved again. People stepped closer to the water, though none were brave enough to go in. Everyone watched as the formation tightened again, returning to its previous shape as if nothing happened. This was the moment when the crowd truly understood that the boats weren't simple toys. Toys didn't behave this way. Toys didn't move in patterns. Toys didn't adjust themselves. The joking atmosphere from earlier had completely disappeared. People stood quietly, observing every small movement with seriousness. Even those who came expecting to laugh now stared in deep thought. Slowly, an unspoken question formed in everyone's mind. If these tiny boats weren't toys, if they weren't part of a prank, if they weren't drifting naturally, then what exactly were they? No one had an answer yet, but everyone knew the story wasn't over. Something was unfolding, something unexpected, and the tiny fleet was only the beginning. The tiny boat inside the clear container became the center of attention the moment it arrived at the research center. The team members placed it gently under the bright lab light, and everyone leaned in with quiet focus. It didn't matter how experienced they were, none of them had ever seen something so small built with so much care. Even the tiniest details seemed intentional. One researcher adjusted the magnifying device, and the enlarged image of the tiny vessel filled the screen. The room fell silent for a long moment. The smooth curves, the clean lines, the perfect symmetry, everything looked planned, not accidental. It wasn't just the shape that surprised them, but the balance. The structure was so even that the boat stayed level, no matter how the container was moved. "It's almost too perfect," one of them whispered. Someone else asked, "Who even works at this scale? And why would they put these in the ocean?" No one responded immediately. They all stared at the screen, trying to absorb what they were seeing. The tiny boat had delicate patterns etched into its sides, almost like miniature designs that served a purpose. Perhaps to reduce water resistance, or maybe to help with stability. They weren't sure yet. Back at the shore, the crowd continued to grow. People who had started watching early in the morning were still standing there, glued to the spot. More people arrived with every passing hour. Cars lined the road, and some people even parked far away and walked down to see the tiny fleet for themselves. By midday, there were groups scattered all along the rocky edge, whispering, watching, and recording. Every time the boats made the slightest movement, a wave of murmurs spread across the crowd. The once loud chatter had turned into a quiet buzz of curiosity. Even people who didn't usually care about unusual events found themselves drawn in. A man who normally ignored anything that wasn't work-related stood with his arms crossed, staring intensely at the water. A woman who came for just a few minutes ended up staying for hours, because she simply couldn't pull herself away. A few people still tried to joke about it, but their voices sounded forced, like they were trying to convince themselves it was nothing. Most of the crowd had realized there was something more happening here. A local who had lived by the coast his entire life said softly to the people near him, "I've never seen anything like this." Not even once. A child tugged on his father's sleeve and asked how the boats moved without paddles. The father didn't know what to say, so he just shook his head and said, "Maybe we're all about to find out." At the research center, the team continued examining the tiny vessel. They decided to check the material next. One of the researchers gently removed a minuscule piece from a corner barely visible to the naked eye and placed it. into a small tray for analysis. When the results started coming in, they were even more confused than before. The material wasn't something you could buy at a regular store. It was a type of lightweight composite, commonly used in high-quality model making, advanced prototypes, or small drones. It wasn't dangerous, just unusual to see in such a tiny object. One researcher looked at the data and said, "This isn't cheap. Whoever made this didn't just use random materials. They knew what they were doing." Another added, "But why make so many of them? And why put them in the water?" At that moment, one of the senior team members walked in. He looked at the screen, then at the container, and then at his colleagues. "We need to go back," he said quietly. "We need more samples." They prepared to return to the shoreline to retrieve more vessels for study, but they wanted to observe the full formation first. They all agreed that understanding the behavior of the boats in the water was just as important as examining them under a microscope. When they returned to the shore, the crowd parted to let them through. People were eager to know if the researchers had discovered anything. Some asked, "Is it real?" Others asked, "Is it dangerous?" And a few simply said, "Please tell us what this is." The researchers didn't give any definite answers yet. They didn't want to create panic or spread the wrong information. They simply said, "We're still studying it," which wasn't a lie. They climbed onto the small motorboat again and slowly headed toward the floating formation. Everyone on the shore watched with full attention. The researchers moved carefully, not wanting to disturb the water too much. As they got closer, they noticed something new. The tiny fleet wasn't just floating randomly anymore. The boats were arranged in a pattern, a curved shape, almost like a half circle, and the spacing between them was nearly identical. It wasn't perfect, but it was too consistent to ignore. When the motorboat got close, the boats didn't scatter or drift apart. Instead, they held their positions, as if aware of the disturbance. The researchers exchanged shocked looks. One of them whispered, "This is not normal movement." "They're adjusting themselves." The person steering the boat slowed down even more. They didn't want to cause waves that might disrupt the formation. Carefully, they collected 2 more tiny vessels, placing them into separate containers. Meanwhile, the crowd on the shore watched every second. When the researchers lifted the vessels from the water, people gasped quietly. They weren't joking anymore. They were witnessing something clearly out of the ordinary. After securing the samples, the researchers spent a few extra minutes observing the fleet from up close. They noticed tiny details they hadn't seen from the shore. The little boats weren't just moving, they seemed to be reacting to the environment. When a slight wave approached, the formation shifted slightly to compensate. When a light breeze passed, they adjusted again. These weren't toys. Back at the shore, a man who had earlier dismissed the event as a prank now shook his head slowly. "I was wrong," he said to his friends. "This isn't a joke. Something real is going on here." A woman standing nearby added, "It's almost like they're alive." She didn't mean literally alive, of course. But the behavior of the fleet looked almost coordinated, like the boats were following instructions. The researchers returned to land. And once again, people gathered around, eager for answers. One of the researchers glanced at the crowd and said, "We are learning more. Please give us time." Nobody argued. Their curiosity was stronger than their impatience. Back inside the lab, the team examined the new samples. The results were the same: advanced materials, precise construction, and delicate patterns that required steady hands and expert skill. And they found something else. On one of the boats, near the bottom, there was a microscopic pattern that looked like a layered design. It wasn't a symbol or a signature, just an arrangement of marks that looked meaningful. It could have been part of the structure, or it could be a sign of how the material was layered. But the researcher studying it paused and said, "This looks intentional." Everyone gathered around the screen again. The pattern was too regular to be a mistake or an accident. It seemed like a deliberate part of the design. A quiet tension filled the room. Everyone felt the same thing. The mystery was getting deeper. The senior researcher leaned forward and said, "These are made by human hands." No doubt about that. His words changed the entire atmosphere. Now there was no room left for theories about natural formation or random driftwood. Someone had built these tiny vessels. Someone with great skill. Someone with a clear purpose. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Why would someone go through so much effort to create dozens of tiny boats, build them with such precision, choose advanced materials, and release them quietly into the ocean? No one in the lab had an answer. And the people at the shore definitely didn't either. As evening approached, the tiny fleet was still there, still floating, still holding formation, still confusing everyone who saw it. What had started as a simple, unexpected morning discovery had now turned into a mystery that pulled in researchers, locals, children, workers, tourists, and thousands of curious viewers online. And although everyone kept talking, whispering, and guessing, one thought slowly began spreading through the crowd and the lab alike. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this on purpose, and the real story behind it was still waiting to be uncovered. The next morning started with a strange mix of calm and nervous energy. The sun was rising slowly, spreading warm light across the small room. He woke up earlier than usual, not because he slept well, but because his mind refused to rest. All night, memories kept circling inside him like birds that didn't know where to land. Some memories hurt, some gave him strength, and some confused him more than before. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face gently. For a moment, he thought about staying quiet, pretending everything was normal. It was always easier to hide his feelings rather than speak them out loud. But this time, hiding didn't feel right. He knew he had reached a point where silence would only make things worse. He stepped outside the room and found the house quiet. It felt peaceful, but also a little heavy, like everyone was waiting for something important to happen. He walked toward the small kitchen, where an older woman was preparing tea. She looked at him with soft eyes, noticing the tiredness on his face, but choosing not to mention it. "You're up early," she said kindly. "Couldn't sleep," he replied. She handed him a cup of tea, and he thanked her. The warmth of the cup felt comforting in his hands. He took a slow sip, hoping it would settle his thoughts. But thoughts were like restless waves today, calm for a moment, then suddenly loud again. After finishing his tea, he walked outside to get some fresh air. The morning breeze was cool and gentle. It brushed against his skin like a quiet reminder that no matter how complicated life became, the world still found ways to stay soft. Birds were singing somewhere nearby. Children were getting ready for school. The world around him looked normal, yet he knew his life had changed far from normal. He found a quiet corner under a large tree and sat down. The shade felt soothing. He closed his eyes and tried to breathe slowly. In that moment, he realized something important. Running away from the truth would never bring peace. He would have to face everything, his mistakes, his fears, and his responsibilities. But facing them meant talking to the person who deserved answers. Someone who had unknowingly become the center of his thoughts for days. Someone whose truth had shaken him so deeply that he could no longer ignore it. He stood up, dusted his hands, and walked back into the house. Each step felt heavier, but also necessary. When he finally reached the small living room, she was already there, sitting quietly. She looked tired, too, as if she also hadn't slept much. Their eyes met, and for a second, neither of them spoke. He took a deep breath. "Can we talk?" She nodded slowly, her hands resting on her lap. She looked nervous, unsure of what he was going to say. Maybe she expected anger. Maybe she expected rejection. But he wasn't here to blame her. He wasn't here to shout or accuse. He was here because he wanted to understand. He sat down across from her. For a few seconds, they both stayed silent. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was more like a moment where both sides were gathering courage. "I want you to tell me everything," he said gently. "From the beginning. No hiding anymore." Her eyes softened. She swallowed hard, then not a dot she started speaking slowly, choosing her words carefully. She talked about the years of confusion she faced alone. The times she wanted to tell him, but stopped herself out of fear. The moments when she tried to reach out, but felt the distance between them growing wider. She explained how she struggled to carry the truth inside her. Unsure how he would react. As she spoke, he listened without interrupting. Every sentence felt like a piece of a puzzle he had been trying to solve. And slowly, he began to understand why things happened the way they did. He realized that she wasn't trying to deceive him. She was trying to protect herself. And maybe even him. At one point, her voice cracked. Her hands trembled. She looked down, unable to continue. He leaned forward slightly and said, "I'm listening. Take your time." That small sentence gave her strength. She wiped her eyes and continued speaking. And when she finally finished, she looked at him nervously, waiting for a reaction. She wasn't sure if he was angry, confused, hurt, or something else entirely. She braced herself for the worst, but what she saw instead surprised her. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't blaming her. He was simply sitting there, absorbing everything and trying to process it with calmness she didn't expect. After a long silence, he finally exhaled deeply. "I wish you had told me earlier," he said softly, "but I understand why you didn't." She blinked, shocked by his gentle tone. She had prepared herself for harsh words, but instead she found understanding. He continued, "This doesn't change the fact that we're in this situation now. And even though it's complicated, we have to deal with it together." Her eyes widened slightly. "Together?" "Yes," he replied. "Running away from each other will only make things worse." For the first time that morning, a small bit of relief appeared on her face. She wasn't completely calm yet, but she could feel a weight lifting, even if only a little. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together as he tried to gather his thoughts. "I'm not saying I have all the answers," he admitted honestly, "but I'm willing to try. That's all I can promise right now." She nodded, her eyes shining with mixed emotions: fear, hope, gratitude, and uncertainty. The room stayed quiet for a while, but it wasn't a heavy silence anymore. It felt like the kind of silence that appears when two people are finally ready to rebuild something that was broken. After a moment, she stood up. "There's something else you need to see," she said softly. He looked at her with curiosity. She walked toward a drawer and opened it slowly, pulling out a small envelope. She handed it to him carefully, almost nervously. He hesitated for a second, then opened it. Inside was something that made his breath catch for a moment. It wasn't traumatic or shocking in a dangerous way. It wasn't something that broke YouTube rules or caused fear. It was simply a piece of truth, something real, personal, and emotional. He stared at it for a long time, feeling a wave of emotions wash over him. Confusion, relief, sadness, hope, all mixed together in a way he couldn't easily name. "Why didn't you show me this earlier?" he whispered. "I was scared," she replied quietly. "I thought you'd walk away." He looked up, meeting her eyes with a calm but serious expression. "I won't walk away. Not now." That sentence felt like a bridge, one that connected their broken paths again. Not perfectly, not magically, but enough to move forward. He placed the envelope on the table gently. "We'll figure this out," he said. "Step by step. She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. For the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe again. The morning that began with worry ended with something unexpected, a small but real sense of direction. The truth wasn't easy, but it wasn't destroying them either. Instead, it was giving them a chance to start again, this time with honesty. Even if the path ahead was uncertain, and deep inside, he knew the next part of their journey would test them even more. But at least now, they were no longer running from the truth. They were walking toward it, together. The day moved slowly after that conversation. Even though they had spoken honestly for the first time, the weight of everything still hung between them. It was lighter than before, but not gone. He felt like someone who had walked through a long, dark tunnel and finally seen a bit of light at the end. But the light wasn't bright enough yet. There was still more to understand, more to face, and more to fix. After she handed him the envelope, and he had read what was inside, something inside him shifted. It wasn't anger anymore, and it wasn't fear. It was responsibility. A quiet, steady sense of responsibility that he could no longer push away. He kept thinking about her words, the truth she had been holding on to, and the courage it must have taken for her to finally share it. It wasn't easy for her, that much was clear. And even though he still felt hurt that she hid it for so long, he couldn't blame her completely. Life had taught both of them to protect themselves, sometimes too much. He stepped outside again just to breathe. The afternoon sun was gentle now, softer than the morning. The air smelled of dust and fresh tea being prepared somewhere nearby. A couple of kids were laughing and running around the street, their energy filling the otherwise quiet surroundings. He watched them for a moment and felt a strange sadness mixed with hope. He wondered how things could have been, if life had gone differently, if the truth had come earlier, if he had been braver, or if she had trusted him sooner. But thinking like that felt pointless now. The past couldn't be changed, and worrying about what-ifs would only make things worse. He heard footsteps behind him. She had come outside too, but she stayed a few steps away, unsure if he wanted her there. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the sky, and she quietly stood beside him, not too close, not too far. After a while, she spoke softly. "Are you angry with me?" He thought about it. Not quickly, not carelessly, but honestly. "I'm not angry," he said, just trying to understand everything. She nodded slowly. She didn't expect forgiveness so fast. She didn't expect sweetness or comfort. She just wanted clarity. He turned toward her, his expression calm. "What I saw in that envelope, it changes things. It makes everything real." She looked down, her fingers twisting nervously. "I know. But," he continued, "it also tells me something important. You didn't lie out of selfishness. You were scared." She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, a small tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it quickly, hoping he didn't notice, but of course he did. He stepped closer, not too close, but enough to show he wasn't running away. "Whatever happens next," he said gently, "I won't let you handle it alone." Her eyes lifted slightly, surprised by his calmness. She had imagined dozens of outcomes: anger, rejection, distance, but not this. Not someone choosing to stay. They stood quietly for a few more moments. The wind moved softly between them, carrying the faint sound of people talking and bicycles passing on the street. She finally gathered some courage. "There's something I want to ask," she said carefully. He turned toward her fully now. "Go ahead. What are you thinking?" "Right now, honestly." He looked away for a second, organizing his thoughts. "I'm thinking I need time. Not to run away, but to prepare myself for what's coming." She nodded in understanding. "I'll give you that," she whispered. But I'm also thinking, he added, that maybe this is happening for a reason. She looked confused. What reason? He smiled gently, not a big smile, just a small one that carried a bit of softness. Maybe to teach us something. Maybe to make us stronger. Or maybe to give us a chance to fix what we never fixed before. Her breathing steadied a little. I hope so. They walked back inside the house, not talking anymore, but not avoiding each other either. The atmosphere had changed. It wasn't completely peaceful, but the sharp tension had faded. Later in the evening, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope again. He touched it carefully, not opening it this time, but just feeling its edges. This small piece of paper held something powerful, something that connected their lives in a way neither of them had expected. She walked into the room quietly, holding 2 cups of tea. She placed one in front of him and kept the other for herself. She didn't sit right next to him. She chose the seat across from him to give him space. He looked at her for a moment. Thank you, he said quietly. You're welcome. The calm between them felt fragile, like a glass that could break if someone pushed too hard. So they both spoke gently, choosing their words with care. He finally asked something he had been thinking about all day. When did you first realize you needed to tell me? She breathed in deeply, thinking back. A long time ago, she admitted. But every time I tried, I felt scared you would leave. And I didn't know if I could handle that. He nodded slowly. I would have been shocked, yes. Maybe even confused. But I wouldn't have walked away. She smiled sadly. I know that now. But back then, I didn't want to take the risk. He didn't blame her for feeling that way. He had his own fears too, fears he never admitted. Maybe they both spent too much time protecting themselves and not enough time trusting each other. He looked at her with seriousness. From now on, don't hide things like this again. Even if it feels scary. Tell me. I will, she promised. And I'll try to listen better, he added. They both understood that this promise wasn't magic. It wouldn't erase the past or fix everything in one night. But promises like these were the foundation of trust. And trust, once broken, needed patience to rebuild. After finishing his tea, he stood up slowly. I'm going to take a walk, he said. Do you want company? She asked, almost shyly. He thought about it for a moment. Yes, he said softly. Come with me. Her eyes softened. She grabbed her shawl and followed him outside. The evening air was cooler now, and the sky was turning a deep shade of orange. They walked side by side, not touching, but not distant. Just walking in the same direction felt like progress. As they walked, he spoke like someone talking to himself. Life keeps throwing unexpected things at us. That's true, she agreed. But maybe. Unexpected things bring unexpected strength, too. She looked at him, then at the path in front of them. Do you think we can handle everything that's coming? He took a slow breath. I don't know, but I think we can try. They continued walking, letting the quietness settle comfortably between them. The world around them felt calm, as if encouraging them to take things one step at a time. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more questions, more emotions, more moments when doubt would return. But something inside him had changed. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was facing the truth, facing responsibility, and facing the future with a kind of calm courage he didn't know he had. And she wasn't alone anymore. When they finally turned back toward the house, he glanced at her and said, Tomorrow, we'll make a plan. She nodded. I'll be ready. Everything wasn't solved yet. Far from it. But the first real step had been taken. And sometimes the first step is the hardest part of the journey. The next morning arrived quietly. There was no loud noise, no dramatic moment, just a calm and gentle start. But inside the house, both of them knew this day was different. It wasn't like any other morning they had lived before. Today was the day they would stop running from the truth and start walking toward it together. He woke up earlier than usual. Sleep had come slowly, and even when he rested, his mind kept wandering through everything that had happened. The truth, the envelope, the conversations, her fear, his confusion, each thought circled in his mind like small waves, hitting the shore again and again. But strangely, he didn't feel lost. He felt awake. Fully awake. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the quiet settle in. Sunlight was slipping through the window, soft and warm. A breeze carried the sound of someone sweeping the street outside. Life was going on around them, as it always does. But he felt changed. It was the kind of change that happened slowly, invisibly, yet deeply. When he walked into the main room, she was already there, sitting with her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. Her eyes looked tired but peaceful. She had spent the night thinking too, not in fear, but in hope that maybe they could fix what was broken. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning," he replied, taking a seat across from her. For a moment, they just sat there, not talking, just breathing the same air. It wasn't awkward. It felt like two people gathering strength before something important. He finally spoke. "Are you ready to talk about everything today?" She nodded. "Yes, I'm ready." "Good," he said with a calm voice. "I am too." They both knew this discussion wouldn't be simple. It wasn't a story you could explain in a few sentences. It was emotional, layered, and connected to years of silence. But today, they weren't avoiding anything. He leaned back slightly, trying to gather his words. "Before we start," he said, "I want to say something." She looked at him with quiet attention. "I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes too. Maybe not the same as yours, but mistakes that also created distance between us. So I don't want today to be about blame. I want it to be about understanding." Her eyes softened. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." And he continued, "I want to make something clear. I'm still here. I didn't run away. And I won't." Her breath caught for a moment. She had been carrying that fear for so long, the fear that he would turn away the moment things became difficult. But hearing him say the words out loud felt like someone had lifted a heavy stone from her chest. She swallowed gently. "I'm grateful. Truly." He rested his arms on the table. "So let's talk. From the beginning. Everything." She nodded again, steadying herself. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but she spoke honestly. She explained how fear had built up inside her over the years. She told him about the moments when she almost told the truth, but stopped herself. She shared how she had carried the guilt like a shadow following her everywhere. And she admitted how loneliness had been her biggest enemy. He listened quietly, carefully, without interrupting. There was a softness in his expression, not pity, but understanding. He could see how much courage it took for her to open up like this. When she finished speaking, the room fell silent. Not a heavy silence, but a thoughtful one. He took a slow breath. "Thank you for telling me everything," he said. "I know it wasn't easy." She nodded, brushing away a small tear. "I didn't want to hide anything anymore. I was tired of being scared." He looked at her with a steady gaze. "And now that I know the truth, I'm not going anywhere." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak, but she couldn't say anything for a moment. She simply looked at him with a mix of gratitude and relief. He continued, "We can handle this. We just need a plan. We need to take things step by step." "Yes," she said softly. "I want that too." They talked for a long time, longer than they ever had. They discussed what the future might look like, what changes they needed to make, and how they could rebuild trust. None of it was easy, but for the first time in a long time, they were speaking with honesty instead of hiding behind silence. After a while, he stood up and walked to the window. The day outside was fully awake now. Children were heading to school. Motorbikes passed on the road, and birds rested on the electric wires. Everything looked normal, but he felt like he was seeing the world differently. She walked to stand next to him. "What are you thinking?" she asked gently. He didn't answer right away. He stared at the street for a few seconds before turning to her. "I'm thinking, maybe this is a new beginning." Her eyes filled with emotion. "Do you really think so?" He nodded. "Yes, but it depends on both of us. Not just you, not just me. Both." She took a small breath. "I'm ready to try." "So am I," he said. They looked at each other in the quiet morning light, and something subtle but important passed between them, a sense of shared strength. A sense that they could build something new, something real. If they kept choosing each other. Later in the day, they prepared to step outside again. There were things they needed to take care of, calls to make, people to inform, questions to ask, answers to search for. But instead of facing it alone, they were facing it together. Before they left the house, she gently touched his arm. "Can I say something?" "Of course," he replied. "I know I caused pain. I know I kept you in the dark for too long. But I never meant to hurt you. I just want you to know that everything I did, even the hiding, it came from fear, not lack of love." He looked at her steadily. "I understand, and I'm not holding it against you anymore." A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from sadness. It was from relief. He reached out and wiped it gently. "No more hiding. No more fear. Whatever comes, we'll face it." She nodded with a trembling smile. As they walked outside, the sunlight fell on them like a quiet blessing. The world hadn't changed, but they had. Their steps felt lighter, their breathing calmer, and their hearts more open than before. They went through their tasks slowly but confidently. They asked questions, spoke to the right people, gathered information, and tried to understand everything they needed to know. It wasn't easy. Some moments felt overwhelming, but each time one of them seemed lost, the other stepped in with calmness. That was the beauty of what was happening between them now. They had become each other's support, not each other's fear. By late afternoon, they returned home. Tired, yes. Emotionally heavy, yes. But stronger than they had been when the day started. They sat together in the living room, neither of them speaking at first. He finally broke the silence. "Today was a big step." "It was," she agreed softly. "And you did well," he added. "So did you," she replied. A quiet smile passed between them. He leaned back in his seat. "I think things will get better from here." "I hope so," she said. "They will," he said with a quiet certainty. "Because we're not running anymore." The evening sky outside began turning orange and pink. A peaceful glow filled the room. She looked at him again, and this time her smile carried something gentle, something warm, something that looked a lot like trust. He reached out his hand toward her. She hesitated only for a second before placing her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like they had belonged together all along, but had only just found their way back. He looked into her eyes and said, "Whatever happens next, we're in this together." She squeezed his hand lightly. Yes, together. The world outside continued moving, unchanged and unaware. But inside that small home, a new chapter had quietly begun. Not with loud promises or grand speeches, but with simple honesty, steady courage, and two people choosing to face life side by side. And sometimes that is all a new beginning needs.